That's what she said.
Oh, can you just click the got it?
Can I leave? No, I'm just kidding.
Great, great. And so Jason is kicking us off in, I think, a really interesting way, so combining research and teaching.
Yeah, probably could have picked a more glamorous title. Maybe that's why people aren't here. Like, who wants to go to an assessing
You get
effective
rich,
teaching?
don't worry.
Should have been nature nurture. Oh, that would have worked so well.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. So this is a sabbatical project that was during COVID's first semester. So back in 2020, and in the middle of that semester, the schools went to virtual. So I was doing part of the project, of course, while teaching 2 7-year-old and a 9-year-old. So, but so I'm going to be talking about the seminar and then maybe what led to the idea to assess it. And I tried to, make a quick list. When I told Chris this, I thought we had 15 minutes. I'm like, I got to have 3 slides, 5 minutes per slide. But now I probably added too much. But these are the discussions I'm going to talk about. Why does nature nurture matter? And every time I teach the course, I see something different. And I think recent events have made things even more apparent to me. So I'll cover some of the recent issues. And I know I have a publication with Dr. Tom, who's not here, but I'll talk about him as if he's here. Like what that paper was about was kind of the first investigation into the paper, really a paper about the course. But we devised a scale to assess students' learning of some of the topics. And I built that scale with Tom's help. So I'll talk about that in the third part. And in the fourth part, like the recent project, the sabbatical project, and then what I might do next. So I have another idea that I came up with in the last few weeks actually for that too. So I'll start with someone posted to the chat.
Me.
You want to help me with the chat?
Just told them
That's just you. Okay. That's one thing I've always struggled with. I did hybrid teaching the first couple. I never had a way to get into both without closing the screen. But so it is a core issue. I put anybody who teaches psychology knows that there's like recurring themes, and one of them is nature nurture. How do traits develop, or how do characteristics come about? What do you call it? Quantitative or qualitative? The recurring themes across all of our courses. And I see nature nurture in all classes. I just talked to my students about their second paper, which was assessing how nature nurture is presented in the textbook. Now, the challenge, of course, is when they get a personality textbook. The textbook that they use for Therese's course has theories per chapter. So then it becomes a critique of the theory, which to me, I think general psych and developmental courses do a better job of covering content that relate to my seminar, which I just give you a short list here of some of the things we cover. Students, and I think lots of professors may not notice the difference between heredity and heritability. Heredity speaks to genes and chromosomes, the biological aspect. Heritability really comes from a field called behavioral genetics, which is studying populations. And then they have findings related to heritability. So highly heritable traits include intelligence or personality. And oftentimes when textbook authors present that, they kind of flip-flop heredity around as if it's 90% inherited, which is not what heritability tells us. So I spent a good chunk of my class circling around that concept. I don't know how well students accept it. It took me a while to process it. I tell students this, that my advisor in grad school, as part of preparation for teaching a class, had me teach just about heritability. And I remember preparing for that talk, which was 15, 20 minutes too. And I was flummoxed. I was like, how do I talk about this and explain it in a way where it shows that I understand it? And I didn't, which is why it was so hard. And 2 populations in particular that I cover, and at the end today, I'll close why twins in adoption studies are not the perfect populations to do the nature nurture question, which the logic of twin studies is pretty clear, right? We have 2 sets of twins, monozygotic and dizygotic twins. You're all fully aware of course, perhaps the monozygotic twins are clones. There are small genetic differences between them, but in principle, they're clones. Dizygotic twins, commonly called fraternal twins, are 2 sperm, 2 eggs, about 50% similar, right? And so it's a population of interest because we can look for trait similarity and contrast them. And what we tend to find, of course, is not that surprising, is that identical twins tend to share more traits. But there are other aspects of their development besides genes they also share. So I'll highlight that with you. This is kind of like, look at this as almost another seminar. But so those are themes. And then, of course, there's this real question underlying it about genetic determinism, or a more common or modern term here is genetic essentialism, which is when people look at genes as the essence of who they are. it defines who they are. It separates races and sex, male and female. We can look at biological accounts that explain all of this. And this, of course, has consequences, right? So when I suggest that it's not really just an academic debate, it's just brought this up in my talk before I came here. My students were silent. And I'm like, can't you see how questions of nature nurture affect people's opinion, for example, of Head Start? So a few of them shared opinions, but went down this path of like, I think it has value and I don't think it has value. So it became kind of an argument. But my whole point was like, if you think Head Start has value, you're taking a nature nurture perspective. If you don't think it has value, and that things like intelligence and school achievement and grades are already kind of set based on biological or genetic things, then you're also taking a position on Head Start. So really you are. And same thing with medical advances like genetic treatments or gene therapy. So I see it as pretty much overarching a lot of choices people make during their lives. And I put a couple other examples here: parent-teacher beliefs about grades, and then the students themselves. Right? When they get a grade, they might have an explanation for their performance. Whether it's environmental, they prepared a lot, or maybe it's I'm just not capable of math. You know, during advising, some of you might, I've heard this a couple times this semester for the first time in a while. Like, I'm not good at math. I'm like, what does that mean? Does it mean you don't want to take a course because you can never do it? And in Eastern philosophy, when they talk about students and teachers and academic achievement, it's not about ability, it's about effort. So I find this difference in perspective to be troublesome, but also nature nurture related, right? So, and then it's hard to get more current than this, but people's opinion on how race affects psychology. I think, thankfully, last year, those of you who are not psychologists, I know Michelle shared this with all of us who are in the department. The APA came out with kind of a formal apology for systematic racism and how psychology played really a fundamental role in pushing racial bias, race differences. And I've covered eugenics in my developmental course since I've been teaching the class, because I feel like I did not learn about it until graduate school, and it was troubling, but I think it speaks to people's underlying beliefs. What I told my class today is like American approach to intelligence. And I think it's still there. But you know, in that apology, they're talking about it's not enough just to apologize. We need to teach about it. We need to like remedy it. That's part of the challenge. But at least now we're acknowledging that psychologists weren't on the sidelines. We weren't like not participating. We were participating and not on the right side of the issue with race. So there are names here. Of course, Galton's more known for statistics, but he also is believed to start the whole nature nurture question. Henry Goddard took IQ tests to Ellis Island and helped pass the first immigration laws just to try to make himself more notable. Of course, these laws are still on the books for different reasons. And as I told my class literally just a few hours ago, we still make arguments about immigrants with kind of eugenic principles underlying this. Like, we're going to affect our country and the fitness of our country, hold the country down, make it less successful. I see eugenics in those same immigration arguments. Louis Terman translated Benet's first IQ test into English, and he also adopted this eugenics philosophy about breeding. So I skipped right over eugenics. I saw a lot of nodding when I mentioned eugenics, but it's a philosophy of breeding that we have to worry about the fitness of genes, and we should encourage people who are fit to have more kids and people who are unfit to have fewer kids. And it was worse than that. We encouraged euthanasia and forced sterilizations. And the US actually was more involved in this before the Nazis adopted the same approach. And I shared a brief video in my class where the Nazis credit the American eugenicists for giving them the idea. And so I look at my class and I'm seeing some more expressions here. They're like, what? Yes, eugenics was huge in the US for decades before the Nazis and Hitler decided, you know what, this is a good idea. And people who are eugenicists would say it took the Nazis. I don't think it took the Nazis. Eugenics is a bad philosophy by itself. So it's referred to as pseudoscience. It's not real science. But one reason why I pulled this in here, you guys may not be able to see this, but psychology is right there. Statistics is here, biology. So they kind of argue that the foundation of their principle of breeding is all of science almost, underlies the philosophy of trying to better society by ridding it of less fit and encouraging people who are fit to have more. So, and a perfect storm happened, of course. Eugenics was a very popular philosophy for decades. IQ tests came about 1905, 1916. the two of them got combined and American psychology ran with it. So we decided we're going to use this as a tool to find the unfit. And that's how it was used for decades. I kind of think IQ tests have multiple purposes today. It's not typically for screening or labeling, but it still has that in its background, right? So it's hard to look at an IQ test without seeing a bit of selection and fitness kind of points. So, okay. So more recent, we'll go fast forward from the 1905 kind of issues. This is an article I have students read from 2017, where Charles Murray, you may remember Murray and Bernstein wrote the bell curve in 1994. Murray is actually still promoting books and positions. And this was at Middlebury College, where his talk was canceled because of protests, but you can see the poster there, no eugenics, is he's still putting out positions that ring of selection, and in the bell curve, there was an argument for getting rid of social programs like Head Start, because Head Start has no long-term impact on IQ scores. And I tell my students, they're actually right about that. There's been a persistent racial difference in IQ scores. So when they make the next statement that it's highly heritable, that's where the controversy comes. Like, what does heritable mean? Most people take that to mean genetic. Are you saying there are genetic differences that account for the race differences in IQ scores? That's not what I said. That's what they said, right? That's not what I said, but you put the pieces together, as I just told my class. It doesn't take a genius to make that assumption, right? That scores on intelligence tests are based on genes, which is a far too simplistic view of intelligence, right? But this article is actually written by behavioral geneticists. You can't see their names and you may not recognize their names, but I have students read this article both because it's current, but because the behavioral geneticists who wrote this article really aren't taking any responsibility for their work on heritability, which is why Murray makes his argument. So they argue that Murray is oversimplifying heritability. And in the next sentence, this is what they say. It is a description of the human condition, heritability, according to which we are born with certain biological realities that play out in complex ways. So that's it there. So how did Murray oversimplify it? If it's a biological condition, biological reality. What's a biological reality? And then later on in that same section or page, the heritability of intelligence is no longer scientifically contentious, to which I would say wrong, right? Because what do you mean by heritability of intelligence? So then they say, well, this is they mischaracterize our research, but they're actually using their terms. Murray is, I mean. So I'm just as bothered by the people who are bothered by Murray here. This is kind of confusing point I think I take when I cover that article. Like, do you see their argument? What do you want us to know? So a colleague who's on sabbatical had me become aware of this more recently. This is less than a month ago, a talk from a clinical psychology doctoral candidate at UVA, who's a behavioral geneticist, who noticed that there were an increasing number of articles being published in psychology journals about intelligence and so forth from the far right. So they're really sneaking in articles, I would say. Well, sneaking is not the right word. Sometimes it's pretty overt. Articles, and his job for this talk was to convince us of how it's pseudoscience, using heritability inappropriately. So there's another theme here, right? So behavioral geneticists is arguing they're using our data the wrong way. They're making arguments that are beyond what we're saying, which I would say really. So in his talk, this is one of the articles that's going to be cut off a bit there. So I could probably just read the title of the article that he kept referring to as an example. So this is an article from 2020, Racial and Ethnic Group Differences in the Heritability of Intelligence, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis. He called that a pseudo-scientific article, but it was published in Intelligence. And here are his reasons why we need to care about this, right? And I agree with many of these, right? Number one is this return to eugenics. So in his presentation, he walked through a lot of people in psychology and statistics who were eugenicists. So he basically turns like the APA did, saying, look, here's the history. Science and psychology and math have this connection to eugenics. We do. And that's an honest admission. But then he says, like, recent events have made this, misuse of our work more common, right? And so open science means people have access to information they didn't have access to. Articles, they can pull it, they can contact people, they might manipulate things, and then put out something else. Misrepresenting the mainstream literature is the one where I'm like, it's not really. It's much like the quote that I read from the other article. If you just read things carefully and the phrasing of heritability, I think we can see how the public, people who might be of either persuasion, left or right, can use that to make an argument towards genes and racial differences. Failure of peer review, probably talk about this for a long time, but the editor of Intelligence made the point, like, this is the whole purpose of academic freedom. We should put the article out there and let people see it. And then maybe we can use it as a moving science forward. So he said there are 3 possible solutions to these articles that are making kind of racist use of behavioral genetic work. Ignore it, respond actively, which just maybe the effort at that, right? Holding a talk to educate people who are interested in this. I actually didn't know how many people were there. It might have been like 10 of us, I think. Label it, then ignore it. I don't know about 2 of these. I don't know about labeling it and ignoring it, which I guess is kind of what this is. Responding actively requires a lot more effort, right? So I think for me, teaching my seminar is responding actively, trying to teach people concepts that are out there, but I only teach 15 people every year, sometimes twice a year. So it's a small drop in a bucket of misinformation or genetic essentialism. So those are kind of 2 events that I just want to point out that this is another way nature nurture kind of recurs and is fluctuating. It's affecting the field and it's still out there. So in my more recent paper here with my seminar connected to it, I'll give you a backstory about my seminar. When I was first teaching here and I started at Kutztown, students would often bring up in my classes how a very simple question, is that a genetic trait, Dr. McCartney? And I'd be like, what do you mean genetic trait? And I still hear this question, less frequently perhaps than 2000 or when the Human Genome Project was kind of front page news, but it happens still in different ways. And it made me wonder, well, maybe I need to cover a theory I was exposed to in graduate school in a more intensive way to get people to see how that question doesn't really make any sense, to ask if a trait is just in the genes. So in 2004, I started teaching a seminar at Special Topics. First few years were a little bit rough in getting attendance, but I think right now I have, I guess, good word of mouth. I haven't gone to rate my professor in a while. I usually have 16 to 18 students. And around now, I had a few students drop this week because it's a W date and they had their midterm, but I don't seem to have a problem now, thank you. So, and I built the class to be entry-level graduate. So I have leaders of readings, so students volunteer to lead the class that day. I meet with all the leaders because some of the readings are novel or dense for them. But every person in the room has to submit questions that day, which reminds me, every graduate student has to come to class prepared to talk or contribute. So I tried to, build in all these supports, and then we spend the day talking about 2 or 3 articles, and it seems to work. But it's really an intensive class for them, and so students, one in particular, told me this semester that he's had a lot of anxiety problems before my class. That he's not normally the student who participates, and it's affecting his diet, it's affecting his sleep, and I'm like, oh my God, what can I do? I'm like, well, I have to remind the student that I was a student like that as an undergraduate, my sophomore, junior year. I sat in a philosophy class where the professor walked up and down the aisles and he slammed his hand on a desk nearby and said, I could call on any of you at any moment. I dropped the class. I was like, there's no way I'm going to spend the semester with this guy walking around and being like, Jason, what do you think? I'd be like, I don't think anything now. I'm scared. And I was like, well, it took me years to figure out, I got interesting things to say. I have questions that I can share, but I was, anxious about public speaking. I think he still dropped, but he was talking more and more every week. So I was thinking of my class the same way my class was that year in graduate school, where we had to do the same thing, lead classes. So I built the class like that. The supports of knowing everybody has something to say. They don't always share it, but there's a leader who fluctuates, right? And so his leadership date was coming. That's why he felt anxious. Like it was literally supposed to be today. And then the readings, a lot of them come from graduate school. I try to keep up with newer readings. And in a hallway discussion with Tom, was like, do we have any impact kind of discussion? I've had it with Tom several times in the hallway. Like, why are we teaching? What are we doing? And I thought, wait a second, I've been teaching this class for about 8 years. I think I'm doing something, because the students seem to be, at least in the active discussion, learning things. And I thought, well, maybe this would be a good test of Tom's theory that we're not doing much. I hate to say that, but Tom was on the argument that students are who they are, and we're just barely moving them on their trajectory. I'd like to think I do a little bit more. I think this maybe nudge one way or the other. So developed a scale with Tom, and we assessed lots of classes, so multicultural, lifespan development, which I thought would hopefully cover some nature nurture content, health psychology, and like 2 sections of my seminar. And some of the questions are over here, and this discussion of heritability is on my questionnaire here. And students had to kind of pick 1 through 6, whether they strongly agree with these statements or strongly disagree. And I took neutral out of the option because I didn't want students to be neutral on all of them. I thought that might be their go-to like interactionist answer, right? So I'm like, no, you're going to pick one or the other. So for example, there's one here about height, hair color, and physical features are more genetically determined. That's a very common position, right? That people look at biological, physical, and say genes. And then a similar question down the road is like about complex traits being more environment. So, and like high heritability, low heritability is down here, 10% or 90%. And I was trying to see how much of the class understood this at the beginning across various courses, and then what might happen by the end of the class. So certain items appeared to capture more of the influence. Some of the questions didn't hold much, I guess, which made me kind of sad because I spent some time on these questions trying to think about what in my class is important, what am I covering repeatedly. So when in a specific comparison, so I put out an article, they came back like none of these courses seem to be the same. This is when it was developmental and multicultural and social. So I said, you know what, maybe I'll target a course that has similar types of students and some content that has more explicit overlap. And of course, Carl, your health psychology course, when I looked at the textbook, I didn't ask what you covered, but your textbook at least covered very similar content, right? So it had epigenetics, it had genes, it had twins, and it had 2 systems theories. So in my seminar, in the second half, we spend more time on developmental systems approach, which is a way of answering nature nurture without relying on either one. It's a complicated answer, which is where students get lost. But systems have multiple levels, and those levels interact. So health psychology had 2 systems in the textbook. So I thought, well, let's make that comparison. Maybe during that semester, they're going to get a broader approach to how one of these is multiple levels. This is kind of my systems question. It turns out that question didn't it's maybe kind of sad. But long story short, the seminar, and I think this disappears. Nope. Oh, this is supposed to disappear. But in terms of the decrease in their genetic determinist beliefs, so their bias towards seeing things as being heritable and genetic, their scores dropped by 12 points on average in my class, and in health psychology, significantly less, which generally makes sense given the topics that we cover. So I focus specifically on these terms over and over, and I'm fairly confident health psychology has a lot of other topics that are brought up repeatedly. So I end the article that Tom and I put out with the comment that I think some of these assumptions that we think our classes are going to be addressing are not being addressed. And I think textbooks like general psychology books or developmental books are leaving, they're including terms like epigenetics, but they're not spending enough time explaining how it accounts for traits when they start their chapter with genes and chromosomes. And then Mendel. So you may remember Mendel and his pea pods and the Punnett squares that are in a lot of our textbooks. Turns out when you teach students that and then end with a complex system or epigenetics, they think traits can be genetic, but some traits can be complex, which is not what epigenetics tells us. So it's kind of an add-on, it doesn't have any consequence. So I would say, is there any questions? But I guess we'll have questions at the end. Right, we have questions to do at the end?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So when I summarize the differences in that paper, I started to think, well, what's happening in the class? Like maybe they can give me feedback during the semester. So a student and I put together a Qualtrics survey, really basic, asking about engagement, interest, that's the last one. Oh, class productivity. And then I was particularly interested in one was the open one. Like I wanted them every day after class to go on and tell me what about that class did you find particularly interesting or memorable. The number seems kind of large, but when I go back and look at the responses, some students submitted like 6 for 15 weeks. Some students gave me 20. On average, it's 13, which is not bad, maybe 1 a week. But when you have class twice a week, right? So I did a Qualtrics survey that literally when they get out of class, they can pull up their phone and tap the buttons and give me a response. A couple students at the very end of the semester responded like 10 times in a week. So I was like, well, that can't be. Drop that student. Right. So obviously you're not going to remember what you talked about 3 weeks ago. I'm going to get that in May 1st. But so I wanted to get some idea of what's happening during the semester. And so this is really what I have that's more recent in terms of feedback from my class, the Assessing My Learning title. Sorry, but on the left here, I just share like their reported engagement over the semester and their interest. So thankfully, they were extremely or moderately interested most of the time. So almost 80% for both and over 80% for interest. This is good because it means my impression during the class that the students are engaged and interested, they reported that they were. Although I guess some questions could be like, maybe they're telling me what they think I want to hear, right? That's why would they tell that they've ever, I don't like this class. But so it's positive, and I left off the productivity because it literally is the same exact pattern. So rather than try to squeeze off, I wanted to say half the slide for the narrative analysis that Tom and I put together, that we have kind of a theme in their narratives, and it matches up with a literature that I'll talk about next after this, that students expressed confusion and complexity comments over and over as the semester went on, which, as I tell students in my nature nurture class, like if you're not confused by heritability, you don't understand heritability. It is confusing. People think it means heredity when it doesn't. It's a statistical estimate based on a population. But that's a point that people think they know what it means, but they should be confused by how it's used. And then the complexity point, which is a point that I think psychology tries to teach students, is things are, even simple traits are more complicated. Cancer, intelligence, of course, seems straightforward, but simple characteristics in my seminar get blown up like eye color, that what actually matters for eye color. So it's good to see that there are students who are confused. I guess this is good to see. Students who are confused were more engaged. So maybe their confusion is a good thing, not a bad thing. Students who confused expressed greater interest, right? So that was something we found as relating it to the other Likert style questions that we asked. And then for the complexity, we split it into the front half of the course and the back half of the course, and they were more likely to appreciate complexity in the second half, or at least comment on complexity, I should say. And that makes sense to me because the way the course is built is I cover systems in the second half. So I present the theory that really talks about complexity later. And I brought at least some of the topics from my first half of the course to show you as it relates to my next slide. So you'll see why the first half is not. I think it's complex, but students didn't get complexity in the first half. So there's a quick peek at what we found in the 4-question survey, right? So how do I explain that? So how do I explain the complexity and confusion discussion? So when I went out to try to see, well, how are we assessing complex courses and seminars? There's not a lot of work out there on seminars, but there is a lot on what's referred to as, at least as I'm connecting it here, on socio-scientific issues. Like how do we teach science to kids and make it more engaging and relevant? And I kind of think of nature nurture as that kind of topic. I think child development people come into the class already interested in children and wanting to know about why they turn out the way they do. But nature nurture to me became more interesting as I went through graduate school, and that even though it's a recurring theme at site. So the socio-scientific issues has kind of some core components. All the issues should be complex, should have authentic problems that students can connect to. Like a couple examples here I share from K through 12 science teacher in a middle school decided to teach about GMO crops and have students take different positions on whether we should be genetically modifying food. There are countries in Europe that have outlawed modifying food this way. In the US, we don't. You're allowed to modify food. I think if you talk to people in the Henson School, you learn more about the benefit or not benefit of doing that. I think Les Erickson would tell you that we still do it, even if we don't do it with science, right? We're modifying food genetically. The reintroduction of wolves, of course, people who are scared of wolves and people who live in that area who might be farmers might say, well, I don't want wolves in this forest right next to my sheep or cows. But then, of course, having environments reach some kind of steady state with a natural predator might be a good thing also, right? So, but you can see how these topics might attract students. And then while you're covering them, you can kind of cover content that they could have learned in a dry way, in a really kind of memorization path. So I'm making the connection here that my class, I think, covers lots of socio-scientific issues in psychology. And then by default, students are learning more about genes without even realizing it, right? So that's why I'm connecting nature nurture here. I'll highlight some of the issues on my next slide that I think my class brings up. And the literature here argues that what we're really trying to teach students to have scientific reasoning specifically related to these topics. That skipped a part here in those two examples when they compared the socio-scientific teaching to the traditional way of teaching. The students who were presented the more interesting, relevant, complex way end up doing better on the measures of outcomes. So I think that maybe relates to the difference in outcomes for my class on those specific topics. So we want students to appreciate complexity. This is what I think most of us tend to think of. I know I used to think of it as just critical thinking. Like we wanted people to appreciate the alternate perspectives and have a healthy skepticism of what you're reading. So question almost everything, but not like question in a negative way. I think critical thinking for some students means you have to attack it. And that's not what we mean, really. So, so this next slide is crowded, but I will walk you through the examples. I'll just kind of refer to the right side here, and this is going to get cut off again. Like what I do in my class that I think students might pull them in and make them interested. So I start with, on the first day of class, with a CDC blog post that has a title, Think Before You Spit. And it's about take-home genetic tests. And they're increasingly popular now. It's like billions and billions of dollars. People can buy them at Walmart and Target. I think you can buy them online now. And the CDC wanted to basically lead people to be thoughtful about buying these genetic tests, because it turns out some people have strong reactions to finding out information that may not be that informative. And they may not seek genetic counseling, which is, I think, a very useful field, especially with this booming personal genetic testing. So this is kind of an example of a socio-scientific issue, right? Personal over-the-counter genetic testing. The first kind of natural experiment I bring up is the war babies around World War II. The Nazis cut off a region in the Netherlands because they were supporting the Allies. And so we can study that group because during pregnancy, certain females were starved first trimester, second trimester, or third trimester. And it had consequences on the offspring. And an interesting outcome was for pregnancies that included starvation in the first trimester, the impact wasn't on that next generation. It was on the third generation. And of course, students are very confused how that could be, right? So I bring up at least two possible answers. One is and it's only through the females. So female babies who have babies after. So I always think about the third generation. Is when you're a female in utero as a fetus, your eggs are developing. So the starvation that you experienced also impacted likely your eggs. And that might have been epigenetic modification. So it accounts for how do you affect 2 generations later, because that generation, part of them is already there. But students don't think of starvation and the generational impact that way, right? So I think it's a historical event that actually has ramifications and connections to complexity. The boy or girl discussion is a reading about a case, another natural experiment. David Reimer, who tragically had his penis burned off, and the parents had no idea what to do with him. I think some of you probably have heard this case. For some students, this is the first time they've heard about David Reimer, and they had no idea what to do. We raised him in this deformed way, and the parents, I'll put this way, unfortunately got linked up with Dr. Money at Johns Hopkins, who decided to use David Reimer as a test case for his gender neutrality theory. So we can raise a child from birth to be anything, boy or girl. Long story short, I forget his name changed, but he eventually went to David Reimer. So lived as a girl for a good chunk of his life and never really adopted or accepted it. And that's in the chapter that is used for my class. And so students get to see how, like, what affects sex? What affects gender? Why did he never adopt to this? And it's because the gender neutrality theory is false, because gender and sexual identity is impacted by hormones and prenatal exposure. So I try to teach students how complex these issues are. And this, of course, relates to current issues like I forget the proposition that was North Carolina, where they said you had to use the bathrooms that matched the sex on your birth certificate. And so why would this be different? And I try to tell students, well, there's a lot more variability out there than we know about, right? And so we circle around for at least a couple of days on that. So that's a very interesting week of discussion. Judith Harris came out with a book in 1999 about the nurture, called The Nurture Assumption, where she took a position that parents have less impact than they think. And argued also that peers matter more than parents. And it was all based on behavioral genetics findings. Turkheimer put out an article, so I get to talk about who has more influence, parents or peers. And we circle around the heritability coefficients. And then the next class, we talk about Turkheimer's reading, which he is a behavioral geneticist. Like, why did Judith make these arguments? So it kind of goes back to those recent controversies that I told you about. I get to explain what Harris got wrong about heritability. And in fact, Turkheimer in that reading from 2000 tries to say Harris got it wrong. So he makes the point that it's not as simple as what she said. But even in that article, if I could pull up a couple quotes for you, you would see he seems to be making her exact point in his article. So you're trying to say she's on the other side, but you're actually on the same side. So I put the two in blue here to bring up these 2 points about the populations that are used for behavioral genetics. So I said, I feel like I'm teaching a seminar to you guys again, but why are twins not the best way to study nature and nurture? Well, it turns out for monozygotic twins, some of them can actually share a chorion, a single placenta. And that means their prenatal development differs from dizygotic or fraternal twins. One of the theoretical pillars of behavioral geneticists is called equal environment assumptions. Right, so both twins have the same environment, prenatal and postnatal, and it turns out that's false. For identical twins who share a chorion and a blood supply, the timing of exposure is virtually identical because they have the same blood. For the other twin pair, you can't make that assumption. Sometimes things cross one placenta but don't cross the other. But behavioral geneticists always make the position, well, there's other things about twin development. I could talk more about the chorion and what happens here. Sometimes for monozygotic twins, there's a condition called twin transfusion syndrome. One of them gets more blood than the other one, and it's potentially life-threatening. So behavioral geneticists will say, well, see, that makes them different. So there's a lot of things that are there, but we're just assuming all that's the same. And I'm like, well, there's differences. So you can't make the assumption that the environment is equal. That same problem shows up differently in adoption studies, because for adoption studies, the argument is the homes that kids get placed in are random. Right? It could be any household. And if you know anything about criteria for adoption or trying to adopt, you have to meet a lot of criteria, right? So stable job, criminal background check, investigating your homes, interviewing family for referrals. So, and I just asked my students today this very question, like, do all families have to do this before they have their kids? Of course not. So adoption families are better than average families. They're not random, they're selected. And we talk about how adoption studies don't really necessarily prove that genes or environments matter more. So those are examples of how I walk through students through the challenges that come up with heritability, and then we circle back to the heritability arguments again at the end of the class. My next steps, I've come across a few surveys that are, one is online and it's international, but I took it myself. Had really good questions, investigated more real world topics and applying what people think about genes. So it's much more applicable to real world circumstances than the NNBS that I used for my earlier paper and research myself for my class. So I thought, one thing we could look at is differences between psych and biology 101 and how we present genes and how much impact we actually have on genetics. And those are 2 large enrollment classes. And I know in both of them we cover genes. So I figured we can compare and contrast, pre and post, perhaps the consequences of those classes. I'm not leading my seminar, but I thought, well, a bigger impact is in these larger classes, and they have not just larger populations, but we can see which course, and I think the bio course, if I had to share, would likely have a bigger impact. But having gone through some of these teaching symposiums we have here at Salisbury, in the Henson School, the faculty over there are dealing with the same challenges we are in psychology. The students come in with a lot of misconceptions about what genes do. They spend a good chunk of their semester trying to modify that. So it may actually not have that much impact. But I have a distinct feeling that faculty in biology would like to know some of these results also. So that's kind of where I think I'm going to go next. So thank you. I don't know who's online. Sure.
Questions? And then we'll transition. Questions or comments for Jason?
Sure, Carl.
Comment, I just got intelligence in 101, and I always think of you on this topic because I realize how much is not really understood out there. It's a big task because we don't have a lot of time to spend on it. So,
Oh yeah. Yeah, I think whenever I cover intelligence, I end up circling that around eugenics just because I think the foundation of where the test came from, and like when they were created in France, like his goal was to help people and thought of intelligence as something that was flexible. But when we brought it here, it's been used for all kinds of purposes. Or starting with,
so a lot of what you said reminded me. I got to circle back to that. Add a little bit of that.
Yeah. And I think students are naturally kind of interested, especially if you can bring up the APA statement that was brought up, right? So we're acknowledging that we were part of the problem, and that now we need to do a better job of covering this, right? I think it affects students and teachers. And I still think, and that's what I told my students, this eugenic thinking is out there. It's not, people don't say they're eugenicists, don't think that genes determine intelligence, but they still think things like, left brain, right brain, you have learning styles, and that's how I learn. So they have this biological bias, which I think rings to me of eugenics, right? That we're born that way. Sure.
So this is a question that I think partly answers itself. I'm curious what you think about it. So I think we make the mistake of believing that when we teach something, especially something as controversial as this, that students either get it or not get it. Mm-hmm. Whereas I wonder what you think would happen if you surveyed your students 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the line. Because these are attitudes that take a long time to really first get exposed to it, like, that's weird. And then eventually you'll come around to it, perhaps, or not.
Well, over the years of teaching with my second book, The Dependent Gene, the author has this paragraph where he says, like, sometimes he feels like what he might be doing to the reader is creating a vacuum. Like what you thought is wrong, you remove it, but now you have nothing. And then he's like, as nature abhors a vacuum, we got to put something back there. And I tend to think, and I try to get the students to think about what's going to happen a couple of years down the road. I asked them the exact question you just asked. Are you going to fall back into thinking, well, these traits are genetic and these traits are more complicated? And they always dance around, right? But I'm asking them the same thing. Are we going to have any long-term impact? I don't know. That paragraph in that chapter made me a little bit depressed.
But I think what you replace it with is curiosity. Right? You can't get them the facts. If you can get them interested in it, I think you've done your job.
Yeah, I mean, we can lead them on to ask their own questions, right? And then they can find the complexity
They didn't know
right?
these questions even exist.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
It would be interesting if we could test some members of Congress over a period of time.
Well, I share that point because they
make laws.
Yeah, they want to defund Head Start, right? Thinking Head Start using like literally IQ data has no consequence, but that's the focus on IQ scores again, right? And so I make a point, circling back to intelligence again, is like, well, Head Start actually has ramifications and impact that have nothing to do with IQ scores, right? They're more likely to finish high school, more likely to go on to college, are less likely to get pregnant when they're teenagers. But for the conservatives, that's not the responsibility of Head Start, right? We're trying to impact intelligence. which Head Start, a small couple-year program that continues in school, is not going to have that kind of huge thing that 15 years later, their IQ scores are going to be higher. But I think you're right. We should give people tests and follow them for 15 years. And they say we're spending too much money, right? A couple $1 billion. And we're spending a whole bunch of things. Or substance. Okay, I'm done talking about politics.
So
For the
Dave-
record, I went to Head Start.
Oh.
Thank you very much.
Oh,
See,
case closed.
case closed.
Did you have something? I was just wondering if you know of there ever being any discussions like to change that term, you know, the
Heritability?
Like in the scientific community, has there ever been any discussion? Maybe we should change this.
Yeah, well, see, in my prelim for grad school, my advisor asked me maturation. What do you think about that term? Right, and that term also has a lot of baggage, right? It basically implies that we're following this preset pattern just by getting older. And I was flummoxed at the time. I still think I could have done a lot better, right? But heritability, there's a few articles out there, and one by the same author that wrote the book that I used for the second half, that he called it the worst term in science because it naturally gets connected to heredity.
Sure.
And when someone says it's highly inheritable, what do people think? So I don't know how you use it without making it genes, right? But it doesn't mean that,
Right.
right?
Seems like somebody should propose changing the word.
Then the question is, how do you change language, right? So it's a whole other thing.
Well, like nature, nurture, ability.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. And we're gonna switch then to Danielle, who is offering her scholarship and performance.
It's not for something completely different.
Yes, but that's what we like about it.
But actually, really nice, interesting segue.
Yes,
Mhm.
yeah, and I will open that.
Okay, so if I'm out of your way, are you going to start here? Okay,
start
and
here?
then we'll
Yes,
adjust the camera as we need
All right.
to. We're all set. Thank
All
you.
right, let me just see if my clicker is working. Yes, it's working.
Yay.
Okay, awesome. So I'm Danielle Cumming. I'm in the music department, and I've had the great pleasure over basically since I was hired of working with my colleagues here, but specifically in a duo with John Wesley Wright. And John and I had a great chemistry of clicking in my interview, which I think is kind of special. And so we just always wanted to perform together, and we did so more and more. And recently, we just decided, why don't we just call ourselves a duo? Why don't we just formalize our partnership and kind of more actively pursue performing together? And then, of course, COVID hit, and so we're rebuilding our idea of performance as all the arts are. So I have been learning a lot through John about spirituals, and he has introduced me to some profoundly beautiful music that I just didn't know. And I grew up in Canada, and I sort of thought my education was halfway decent, and not as entirely as convinced now that the curriculum continues to develop in Canada. The issues that were big when I was a student were the Queen was coming because she was going to do the Constitution, the repatriation Constitution. Yeah, so that was big. That was basically my grade school. I remember that. I remember Pierre Trudeau, the dad, didn't care what we had to back, and I remember all that kind of stuff. But nobody was talking about the community of freedom seekers. That phrase obviously wasn't being used at all anyway. Certainly nobody was talking about residential schools or First Nations or Catholic Church making an apology. Like Canada is just changing, hopefully for the better all the time. And so my interest was to know more about the music, and specifically in the context of the duo. So that's us. Just before COVID. And we call our duo North Meets South. And we typically present, where am I here? Oh, I explained why I call us North Meets South. So maybe it's obvious. John is from the United States. and I am from Canada. And we met in the middle, in Maryland. We just recently were in Florida, and we were told that Maryland is the north. And I was just like, no, Maryland is not the north. Yeah, we're like, no, Maryland's not the north. So we thought this was kind of cool because literally it's the middle. If we actually kind of measured in miles per kilometers, the distance from Toronto to Salisbury and the distance from Rome, Georgia to Salisbury, it's not that different. So that's kind of cool. We met in the middle. And of course, not that far from the Mason-Dixon line. So when John and I perform together, we frequently do a program called From Spain to Spirituals, which is one of the a genius title of John's. And I think it's a good, and it embraces both of our creative backgrounds because John is a classical singer, highly educated, can do basically any style. So Baroque, Renaissance, operatic, I can sing in many, many languages. And, the classical world is open to him. He opened another door in your own biography with going into the competition for the spirituals at a time when maybe that wasn't necessarily a common step, that classical singers weren't necessarily blurring lines so much. And so so John has this really super broad repertoire, but loves the spiritual repertoire. My repertoire is, as a classical guitarist, well, last week my repertoire was entirely ABBA, but now we're back. My repertoire as a classical guitarist was always centered around Spain, but it also, you cannot be a guitarist without being steeped in more popular music. So I think it's a naturalist fit for folk. When I started guitar, it was, at a community school with the hippie and like chords and strumming. So it was just kind of like a natural thing that I too was not from a single musical strain family at all. So the photograph there that is taken there was the program. And this was a concert literally as COVID was shutting us all down, with just going under the wire. Was at the Roland Hayes Museum. And Roland Hayes, again, I learned about Roland Hayes through John, was an operatic tenor in the early 20th century, overcame a lot, had a tremendous career in Europe. And there's a museum not far from John's hometown of Rome, devoted to his artifacts, letters, scores, all this kind of thing. So we were invited to perform there, and it was wonderful to have him kind of in the background. This was a photo of the stage, and here he was, just sort of gently, his presence being felt. And so tremendous performer. And John, you uncovered the story of him in Rome, Georgia, his wife trying to buy shoes, and like they made the news. So
the town where the museum is, and where his descendants still have a farm, or is maybe 20 minutes from where I grew up. So it's Calhoun, Georgia, even smaller village. I think it's like Curryville or something like that. But there's a farm that's associated, but this museum is in Calhoun, which is right off of Interstate 75. And then Rome is about 20-25 minutes from there. And Roland Hayes is associated with Rome, with being arrested there from this shoe store incident where this basically, unwanted, didn't want them in the store, basically.
So, it's a really interesting, this is all what inspires me to know more. And it must be exhausting to be the people always trying to bring white people up to speed. But I can only imagine. So we see photographs of Roland Hayes and his wife and his children, and they're doing European tours. And the idea that she wanted a nice pair of shoes is not a bizarre thought. And she probably also knew exactly what was going to happen when she walked in that store, because they asked her nicely to go to the African American section of shoes, and she refused. So she knew, and he was famous enough. And so you just realize activism was happening. This was probably in the 30s, maybe 40s. And so that's sort of like beginning of activism, and well, maybe not at the beginning, but so Martin Luther King saying, issues. Yes. So John, performing with John has put us in some fascinating places and fascinating situations. We performed a Frederick Douglass prayer breakfast where his descendants, came up and presented us each with this special edition biography and a narrative of American slave, and like eye contact, making eye contact with someone. I was like, oh, you're descended from Frederick Douglass, and like even now as I say it, like I just have goosebumps. So I find myself in these situations that are thrilling, humbling, make me examine my past and make me examine, my heritage and my country, and like it's not small. So and make me examine my education and the biases that were in my education. So I just figured that I can say that being from Canada, I better do some homework because I didn't know enough about the North to be the North and North and South. So I just thought I have to live up to my name. So I tend to listen to Canadian radio every morning. I just find it grounding, and I need to keep my accent fresh and round. And I've been noticing that there have been more and more stories about the contributions to Canadian society of freedom seekers. And so when I was growing up, no mention whatsoever. Like it was just like, that was in America. Slavery was in the US, thank goodness it was never here. We never had racism. We're good to go. Right? So specifically, even the phrase freedom seekers is just so much nicer than saying runaway slaves. It's just like the idea of like that they were slaves. They were just enslaved, and they got the heck out. So communities founded by American refugees who escaped enslavement in British Canada, because Canada is not really Canada that we know it until 1867. So British Canada is being more accurate. So I noticed this trend of people wanting to know, obviously people wanting to know more, people being interviewed more and more. There's a community outside of Halifax called Africville that they've been more and more aware of. There's smaller communities in Toronto, like Leslieville and areas around there, where they recognized major communities at a time when it was not, Toronto was not a big city. There's an amazing biography put out recently of a couple who escaped, I think, Maryland to Kentucky into Canada, and they founded the first taxi service in Toronto because of their Kentucky time. They got good with horses, and so it was a horse-drawn taxi service, and they used this. They couldn't read or write, the couple. They were very successful, and they used this red and gold logo. And the story that I realized, so I read the book, of course, after hearing the author interviewed, and the red and gold logo becomes the TTC, which I grew up riding the Toronto Transit Commission. And so the public, basically the WMATA of the DC public, is used the red and gold that they took on after they harmonized taxi services and public transit in Toronto in the 20s. So it's just like, nobody told us that red and gold came from the Blackbirds, who coming from Kentucky, who knew horses, it's just like, we didn't get this in our education. So this was my homework. So my sabbatical research specifically was to go and visit sites of significance in Ontario. So not trying to do all of Canada, not worry about the East Coast, just the province I'm from. And specifically that meant visiting small museums, very small museums, and some churches, and to meet with the curators and the historians there, and really just to learn. And I didn't have anything super specific other than I just want to fill in. I just want to be a better North. So I wanted to ask them about music. So I set this all up before going. And so they had a chance to look through their archives before I arrived. So it wasn't a surprise. And asked them whether or not, are there any, what do you have in your collection that are written scores? So the dots on the page. And knowing that that's maybe not the right question, because so much of spirituals would not have been written down. But eventually they were written down because they were collected. And the first publication in the US is from 1867, which is the first publication of like what they called slave songs of the United States. So when people were actually putting out volumes of collections. And it was happening a little bit earlier than that, the idea of put out the songs because you're proving, it was an abolitionist movement of proving the creativity of sort of the humanization of the enslaved by having music publications. So I was asking these Canadian curators if they had any scores, and also just asking if there was any sort of lore letters that said, oh, we always sang this song, or like some mention of music. And then the purpose of wanting to know that was then, is there any music that I could use or arrange for my performances with John? So my perspective is not as a musicologist, it's more as a performer. So it was just kind of like, let's find stuff and let's see what we can bring to our partnership. So as I said, they also understand the North better. So those are my goals. The short answer is the music I found there is fascinating, but not necessarily on point, but I'll talk about what I mean by that. I started first out, do you all know where this is?
So New York.
Yes. Yeah. So it's just the top of the park as Harlem starts. And so there's, you can't really see because of the glare, but there's fantastic intersections. Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, like they intersect. It's just, and so there's Maryland right up there at the foot of Harlem. And so her statue is, she's like being portrayed like a train, like the Underground Railroad, the idea that she's unstoppable, like she's in forward motion. The statue is like really in a very small little parquet, but the force of her is incredible. This, is that also a good picture of my bike that I was borrowing, but it's so Frederick Douglass he's looking up Frederick Douglass Boulevard, like it's quite grand. But what really struck me was this area here has a lot of artwork on it, and I'll see in my next slide I have a closer count there. So it's behind him, but there is this beautiful brass metal wall that has this constellation of the stars, and it has a quote of his in there that just like sort of set my tone for everything. And the quote was, "Under the flickering light of the North Star stood a doubtful freedom, half frozen, beckoning us to come and share its hospitality." And I just thought, what an honest and optimistic quote, because it's not this idea that Canada was going to be great. It's like maybe, and that was so much more accurate. And so I just thought, okay, let's go to the half frozen north, but I went tall, so I'm not stupid. I've been there before. So I want to talk about the places I've been. And so I've got 5 maps to show you, and I'm mindful of my time because we're going to finish with John and be there in a couple pieces. But so in case your geography of Southwest Ontario is a little rusty as mine was before I left, I started out in an area just near Windsor. So all that's Canada, and they're on over. So there's a community just south of Windsor called Amherstburg, and they have a Nazarene African Methodist Episcopal Church. And we're just talking about this. So the idea of the AME and the British Methodist and how they were growing out of each other. So that's something to look at. So this church was built by hand by those who had escaped. It was not built by anybody else other than the people who had gotten across. And it's so beautiful. So on this patch of wall, you can see this. They were starting to like fix the stucco. You see the beautiful like boards and like uneven nails, and like the place really needs money to bring it back. It was almost condemned, the building, like the community has sort of moved on. But there's a trap door in the floor where they're not sure, but there might have been a place for people to hide, because even if you got to Canada, you were not necessarily safe. So The music that I found there, I just took a bunch of scans, and this is a song that John and I were recently looking at for another project. But so there were, these would have probably just been collections in people's libraries that were donated. I don't think it had any particular connection to the community of escaped freedom seekers. But I was able to browse through these books, and they were very, all the curators I met with were very eager to just have me come and stay. So I feel like I've scanned a lot of documents that I'm going to continue to kind of get to over time. So it's sort of like I don't have a finished product from the sabbatical. I have a library of scans, and I think that's quite exciting. What really struck me about this area is look how narrow it is. Like, this was me sitting, all the pictures are by me except for the maps, of course, so apologies for the lack of vividness, but the no wonder it was dangerous to stay here, and that's why many people did it. So this was like the crossing point, get there, hide for a bit, keep going, because slave catchers would come across and try and catch them, and the Canadians were really against the slave catchers, and it was probably because there was a bit of abolitionist, but also it was just like that, how dare these Americans, who do they think they are kind of attitude. So it was not like the Canadians were giving the people back. They were not, they were doing the opposite. And but they were definitely, people were continuing on. So I continued on too. So my next stop, I've gone from near Detroit up to the Dawn Settlement, which is in Dresden, Ontario. Martin, is this familiar? You know, it's like, I do not. And again, there's a Maryland connection. And this was another one of my themes, is that Maryland sort of seemed to be following me around. And for someone who's not from here, I found that really interesting. I kept reading Maryland. So the Dawn Settlement was co-established by Josiah Henson, who was from Charles County, made his way by the Underground Railroad into Canada, and they founded this settlement where it was like a collective, and people could share their skills and their resources, and so newcomers were constantly coming and being assisted. And his autobiography was published in 1949, as I see there, and Harry Beecher Stowe used that to create the character of Uncle Tom. So he was the real life inspiration for Uncle Tom's Cabin. And who knew that was in Ontario? I did not. So I went and had a beautiful tour. This is probably one of the most professional funded museums that I visited. The rest were very much labors of love. So we see there the church where he was a preacher. We see his home and his grave. And I spent an afternoon there just learning all about the settlement and the things that they did. And you can, it's sort of like a pioneer village kind of thing. You can really get the feel of it. But the church is absolutely gorgeous and beautiful acoustics. So I met with Steve. There's Steve. So Steve and I, Steve was very interested in my duo, very interested in John, meeting John, and he was saying, we have to please keep us in mind on Emancipation Day, which is August 1st. So because Canada doesn't celebrate Juneteenth, it's August 1st, which predates Juneteenth because it was the British outlawing of the slave trade. So I think basically what this turned into was me promoting John and us getting gigs. So I think that's okay too. But yeah, it was just beautiful. And his sort of contribution was to say to me, well, you should really look up Sweet Honey in the Rock. And it's just so funny that one of John's mentors is in Sweet Honey in the Rock. So it was just, I was able to say more, get her, yeah, well inspired already. I kept going. So that was a lovely day, but I had to get going because I'd been invited to the baseball game at the Buxton National Historic Site. And this is an amazing community. It's not really a museum, although there is a museum there, but it's like they have an annual family reunion, and the people running it said, well, you must come to the baseball game. And I was just hoping they didn't make me play. Thank God they didn't. But they were so welcoming, and I just ended up coming back for the cookout and for the talent show, and just learning so much just by I thought it would be more like an interview, but it was just like, come to the house, and just so welcoming. So the settlement at Buxton, they have the map there. There's a bell that's hanging in the church, and there's a plaque about the bell that it was given to the community in 1850 from the community of Pittsburgh. So it just shows how much, like literally on the map, this community was for people still in the US, and why it was still such a magnet. And and so it's still a tight-knit community. There's Brian, who had me over to the house. He's a farmer. He's sort of an amateur historian. He's written books and just wonderful. I felt like I had a new family. She's like, can I just stay here forever? So one of the things that he mentioned in passing, and others did as well, that they're sixth generation Canadian. And that really stopped me, because when I was growing up, I was third generation, and I was the only person that I knew who was third. Everybody else that I knew, family from much more interesting places than I did. And so I thought, I'm the Canadian, I'm so boring. And realized that this is nothing. I've been here for 70 years before my family was. And they talked about how they're often never really thought of as Canadian, but they're sort of like, well, you're they've only been here for 6 generations before there even was a Canada. So I found it like it reoriented my perspective of my sense of self and my intention. It was quite a doozy. This is this beautiful schoolhouse that's been maintained, and again, I think it's a perfect place for a baby. Really. It's just the music. I should preface this side. Sometimes I found music that was really offensive, but I took pictures of it anyway. Obviously, it's just for archival, so just a warning. This was the music in their collection. That was the only score they had, and as the plaque says, it was replaced from the 10 little engines, so updated. So it's just horrendous all around. And but I noticed this, and somewhere else that I read that it reminded me of what Robert Smith does, which is collect this racist memorabilia. And one of the women I spoke to, I'm like, doesn't it bother you to have it here and see it? And she said, no, it's an installation and a documentation of white ignorance and bias. And it's just like, okay, just put it that way. It's just like, this is not about the African American and African Canadian community at all. So it's just a documentation of it. So it's obviously, musically of no interest. Next step was St. Catherine's. Is your mom still?
She was in Grimsby, 20, 10, 15 minutes.
I think I went up just there.
In Fruitland.
Yes, exactly. Actually, so I'm like, wait, didn't I just leave? Martin is well aware of this neighborhood. So we're kind of crossing. We're sort of drawing from a different place. So with the Underground Railroad, you had a lot of this side of it was a Kentucky world, although there is a lot of Maryland in here. There's a lot of Maryland over there as well, and that makes sense because it's coming from the east. The Salem Chapel. This is Rochelle Bush, who spent the afternoon with me and told me all about the church. And there's the church is referred to as the last stop because it was obviously the stop of the Underground Railroad. And the church still stands. It doesn't look, the neighborhood doesn't look as nice. It's all built up and doesn't look like it's doing that well. But the church is still there and beautiful. And this is the church where Harriet Tubman was a parishioner for 10 years, and when she lived in St. Catherine's. And that was really astonishing fact to just sit in that church. And so Rochelle was wonderful. She actually had to call the locksmith because it had been so long since anybody had wanted to see all the books in the glass case. So when she got the locksmith to like replace all the locks, and she just left me the key to all these books in the glass display. And these books you can see how old they are. Like they're incredible, these tiny little books of all these scores. And but yeah, she just said, okay, have fun. And so I just sat in the church knowing that, okay, this is Harriet Tubman's church, and I'm holding books that are from the time she would have been a parishioner, because some of the books were published in 1820. Not necessarily to say that the books were physically in the church when she was there, because I think a lot of them were donated, and there were a lot of the donors were from Maryland, and that's when I just kept reading Maryland. And I think it must really be that if you stood a chance of getting to Canada, you were probably starting from a pretty northern spot. And so that's maybe why Maryland seems to be, but it became almost like a bruise. Oh, Maryland again. So Escape from Maryland. The last map I have for you, again, is a Maryland story. So this is quite far north by Canadian standards. It's above Toronto. So it's on Lake Huron, which is a little bit of Georgian Bay. And so that's my last stop. And this is Carolyn Wilson, and she and her sister created and run the Sheffield Park Museum. And what's in the case are blown up posters, recreation posters. Oh, this is very old. Of the typical runaway wanted posters. But this one, Cambridge. So the one on I think the Hudson was actually in Vienna, but it could be brought to the courthouse in Cambridge was the poster to say you could see him and get your money back. And so the catch is, we've all seen these kinds of things before, but the people that are mentioned in these posters were living in this community. So their families are still there. So that's the incredible story, is that these posters were up in Maryland when the families were when the people had made it to the water's edge at on Georgia Bay. And the water makes sense. There were watermen there, there were watermen here. There was a water connection. They worked with ships and boats. So they have here, she was so excited to know that I was from Maryland. I ended up representing Maryland and Ontario, which was just like, no, I'm not the Maryland person. I'm the Toronto person. But this is a rock from the Choptank River. The one that's in Cambridge, right? Choptank, yeah. So it's a Choptank rock that was donated to the museum. And there's Governor Hogan has signed here, a little proclamation, like he's my boss. And also there's a letter from the mayor of Cambridge saying Cambridge and Owen Sound, Ontario are forever linked because of this history of I don't know any of this. So there's I just actually found when I was getting this together that there is more in the article about the donation of the rock and connection of the two communities. So that is my slideshow. And as I say, oh yeah, as I say, that what kept happening was that feeling of Maryland popping up. The lady in the photo at the end, when she was so excited that I was visiting her museum from Maryland, because it's pretty far north. Like it's not, but it's remote. It's like 32 hours to get there from Toronto. But I did pass the Schitt's Creek Motel, which is on the way, so it's out there. But she came out and took a picture. She's like, do you mind if I take a picture of your car with your license plate? It's in Maryland on it. Like this idea that it had come from so far. I come from so far away to visit her. So she's asked me to take a picture of the river. She said, I want to take you to take a picture of your feet in the river. And then it's like, okay, I'll try that. So I will honor that problem. But she has this enormous collection of that racist memorabilia, and a lot of it's music. And I didn't take pictures of it. It's horrific. And so, but she said, yeah, it's we present what we were dealing with, like what we saw, and people just, they're cleaning out their parents' attic and they find it and they give it to her. She has it, like the community knows, but it's a sign of what the community mentality was too. Yeah, so everybody who met me was so excited. I have, a link to show of John there. Everybody kept saying, you must come back. And so then once COVID is done, we have many friends there. So come on down.
First. It's either way.
Well, I'll just say about this. So we have two. The other thing I did in my sabbatical is I took a course through Berkeley Conservatory on guitar arranging, and so I have some fuel for arranging stuff. But it's very, it's challenging. So we have two new pieces that are. I think the ink has just dried. Want to talk about what they are?
Well, I'll say a couple of things. So I have to constantly remind Danielle that, she's not the only one that has to keep re-examining or examining, her area, because if you think about our history, I'm a part of the assimilated South. So, and my parents' approach to my education was to shelter me from the history. I think you get both sides of it. I've, in the course of my life, met many people whose upbringing was quite different, and they wanted their children to be exposed to all kinds of, the civil rights movement and this, that, and the other, whereas my parents lived it and walked it and experienced it and were like, no, you're going to private school and where they're not going to talk about that. And so it's very interesting. And then, so there's, and just the fact that we, I can remember, Black History Month being 1 week, and then I'm not even sure when it became a month. And so again, we are coming from similar places in terms of having to examine and learn and continuing to do so. And then as you were wrapping up, I'm thinking, man, this is a deep subject, because here we are segueing to a subject of generations of the use of eugenics.
It's different, but there's a message of content there overlaps.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm gonna try to move
Turn
the
that
camera to
product.
get you. Yes, that is my hope. Oh,
So I think so these are a couple more comments. So the program that we use the title From Spain to Spirituals is not only interesting because of the reasons Danielle said, that I also tour a lot with a group called the American Spiritual Ensemble, and there's a strong connection to Spain with that group as well. I've spent more time in Spain than I ever imagined that I would. That group is like rock stars in Spain, and so there's this sort of global spiritual interconnectedness with the history there and the interest in the history here. So there's that, and then so the two pieces that we have are My Lord, What a Morning, and Steal Away. Steal Away, both have similar similar in some of the lyrics refer to apocalyptic symbolism, like, you know, the trumpet and the stars falling, and various biblical references to that. Particularly want to say something a little I find a bit interesting about My Lord, What a Morning. Typically, when we think about slave songs, we think about songs that grew from plantation fields, that evolved from folk tunes and evolved into arrangements and that come from the South. But in researching a piece like My Lord, What a Morning, we learned that its roots are in the African Methodist Episcopal churches of Philadelphia, and so are more connected. The lyrics are almost identical in early 1800s, way before the first written tune melodic publications. So did you want to say something? But yes, exactly. Charles Albert Tindley, we have that connection right here again from Maryland to, but Philadelphia being a huge center of folks, you know, flocking to freedom, if you will. So so here we have an example on My Lord, What a Morning of a tune that associated with this AME church that then flowed south to the AME churches of like Charleston, and then more and more tunes, you know, being collected from the islands and that sort of thing. So we just sort of have this assumption that, you know, we associate, and it's true, most tunes we do associate with the South, with rural, with plantation, with churches in the South. And but there are just some exceptions, and there's always exceptions to the rule. And
Which one do you want to do first?
that's it.
My Lord, what a morning. My Lord, what a morning. Oh, my Lord, what a morning. When the stars begin to fall, when the stars begin to fall, done quit all my worldly ways, join that heavenly band. Done quit all my worldly ways, join that heavenly band. Oh, my Lord, what a morning. My Lord, what a morning. Oh, my Lord, what a morning. When the stars begin to fall, when the stars begin to
very famous, very poignant, steal away to Jesus, as we would say, but quite evidence more and more shows us that, you know, these tunes were used in a coded manner, and you in the field singing "Steal Away" to Jesus, and it meant, you know, could mean this was the night you were gonna head out. So, steal away.
Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. Steal away, steal away home. I ain't got long to stay. My Lord, He calls me by the thunder. The trumpet sounds within my soul. I ain't got long to stay. Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. Steal away, steal away home. I ain't got long to stay.
Time for questions?
Yeah, please, whatever you have, and the chat is going crazy. It's
Oh
all, I
my.
love you, I'm so sad I'm on Zoom and then I'm not there.
Oh, we love you too.
This is Southern tradition. Southern tradition, songs about freedom, songs about going through something, and you need to the spirituals to give you support. And some historians refer to the spirituals as sorrow songs. W.B. Du Bois, but spirituals are an intricate part of Southern history, church history, especially the Baptists and the Methodists, and sanctified churches. So it becomes a part of you, whether you want it to or not, because that's how you were brought up during that time, especially in the South. And some museums are now getting into the act of trying to find ways to be inclusive about the spirituals. And Wade in the Water is one of those songs.
Yes.
So they're anxiously looking for portraits that are associated with baptism, riverside baptisms, not in the fancy ones in the churches now.
Right.
baptismal pools. So it's a part. And if you are so as I am, it's a part.
So we are involved in a project right now, co-editing a book and connected to a fairly new museum that it's in Oxford, Maryland, called the Water's Edge Museum. And it's a long story short, but privileged white family moves to that area, 20s, 30s, fascinated by what they hear. And she's an artist and starts to depict what she hears. So that Ruth Star Rose, there's a body of her work that is depicting the spirituals, and they're named spirituals, like her lithographs are called Swing Low Sweet Chariot, Jonah and the Whale, and they're these just incredible works. And so the coffee table book is now the spirituals part of them is now being extracted and turned into a book just about those particular lithographs. And so a contributing writer, and that should be coming soon, as if we survive each other. If anybody of you ever had the experience of writing with your partner in life, that's an interesting experience. So I'm doing that with my husband. So
I'm referee.
yes, and Danielle is the referee. So yeah, any questions?
John Wesley Church. Some of the John Wesley Church.
The Copperville. Oh yeah, I know what you're talking about.
The little church.
Yes.
Driving to Oxford.
Yes, I forget the name, but I think that's it.
And we'll have to arrange, we have to get people.
Yeah, we have to get people there.
So to go there in the summer, to take a
Yes.
ferry across the Belt.
Yes.
Start the Black community.
And they have just gotten, do you know about that?
Yeah.
A huge grant to,
Right.
so there'll be a, and this was all in the owner's, I think in her grand scheme, in the back, when she opened the museum, Barbara Peka. So there's the Black community right across the ferry, Bellevue, Oxford, and so her mind, she always had it in her head that one day there would be a museum there, and then there would just be this ferry ride back and forth, and so that actually is happening. So there's this one property where we went in the freezing.
I was told it was a museum and it's a shell, and it was like, it was
The
so
remaining-
freezing.
The remaining shell that used to be like a,
It's gonna be beautiful, but I had to hand the guitar up and then climb up a ladder into the building.
Yes.
So we crawled in.
Yes.
We made some videos and with Jeremiah Copeland as well, just pre-fame, Jeremiah.
Yes.
And, but yeah, I don't know how the video didn't pick up your breath when it was so cold.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's going to be amazing to have that, those two communities connected.
it really is.
The shoes.
Yes, Colonel Rashid, that's his community.
I know.
Yes.
He has tons of books. And lots of them are.
I think that's what we're talking about. I think that's what we're talking about, is because we had to use the restroom at his home.
Yes.
That's how we climbed down climbed down the ladder, went down the block to use at Colonel DeShield's bathroom. So that's how it
And
worked.
his church that he belonged has a lot of stuff that could be helpful to.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Lawrence, you,
Well, first of all, it was inspiring enough to hear about nature and nurture,
yeah.
but it was a great bonus to have a book on it.
Oh, well,
So
thank you.
so much. That was fantastic.
Thank you so much.
So my wonky question is, Did you find any particular difference musically between the spirituals that you found in Canada versus the ones in the American South?
So it's interesting because what I found in Canada were largely written down hymns and also those sort of parlor songs. And so there was no traceable that I could find in the places I visited and in sort of reference to spirituals that was in any way different from the oral history of the US. And so it makes me think that the work of the Fisk Jubilee Singers and the Hampton College and everything, that work of preserving, it had it not been for that, it would have been sort of forgotten because it's not in any way really recorded in Canada. Like the famous spirituals are in our folk song collections and probably started being included. Like Swing Low Sweet Chariot, probably around 1900 when it was made into a book of Canadian folk songs. But I always thought that was kind of an American import, but in fact it probably was actually being sung in Canada quite organically.
We sang 10 religions in school.
Yes, we did.
We did too, but
Yeah.
there's sort of interesting history to that. So in the Agatha Christie novel, and then There Were None. The original title of that was the same title we saw on that image. But
Oh,
it's
wow.
published in England in 1940. Published at the same time pretty much in the United States, but that title was deemed too improper to use in the United States. So it was okay in the UK, but not in the United States. And of course, now in the United States, it's known as
Right.
There Were None. So just curious, right, what the evolution is on that.
Yeah, kind of following Mark's question, I'm just curious about the written music that you find. Was it written for particular instruments or did you guys adapt it?
A lot of it so in terms of what I saw up in Canada, they were largely hymn books. And so they were, I was really disappointed to open up to, Mozart, like the usual names, right? It's just like 4th, 18, whatever. And so, but in terms of what resources we have been using and are really excited about, I've spent also many days at the Library of Congress and the music reading room, and there are basically all the collections that are ever mentioned are there. And some of them, they hand you, they're wearing the gloves and they put it on the thing and then get it to turn pages. But it's like, so those were often, some of them are just tunes, they're just collected. They talk about how the people collecting them were, the one near Hilton Head, they were saying that they were almost notating it in their pockets while it was being sung, because once they took paper out to notate it, it would stop singing. Like, it's just sort of thing, this is not for you, this is our music, it's not. Don't try anything. So the idea of collecting things had to be done kind of after the fact, often at night or something like that. But so it's fun. I find it fascinating with those hymns because the old tunes, and then there are some sort of famous harmonizations which we're working on today, and the Jolie or something. So by the early 20th century, there's some famous arrangers. So it's almost like as spirituals made it ways to concert scene. There are certain arrangers that added harmonies that we've associated now as the authentic harmonies, even though it's harder for a guitar to do all that because it was so piano-centric. But that was part of my work. This music is so beautiful and so natural for our duo, and I just think guitar affords a flexibility that the piano doesn't have because the piano is there's so much machinery in the piano, so you have to commit. Even the most sensitive pianist is navigating a big machine. And for us, I just feel like I can wait and I feel when John's going to breathe and I can touch the string when it happens. And the elasticity is what I love about it. And that's why I want to work on bringing this music more onto guitar for us. It's not that common.
It made me think about John, you must kind of take what she's doing and kind of uniquely interpret that, I think.
Yeah, I'm having a blast. We're having a blast. So I feel so useful because we sit at a piano and she'll play these chords and then I actually say things like, say the names of the chords like I had training in theory or something. And so and then we go and we figure out what sounds best.
And what can stay.
And
match to put from the piano onto.
Yeah.
And 6 strings in it.
Right. And that really is it. You bring up we could stay all night talking because that brings up a whole other conversation about so why is it him like? Why are these arrangements him like, and why did they evolve? It's because the influence was Europe. So folks wanted to matter just as much as their white counterparts. So the idea was the Black arrangers wanted to shine, and I can counterpart too. And here the Black singers are going to put the spirituals at the end of their concerts, and they can sing as loud, if not louder, than the white opera singers. So it really becomes the great amalgam of plantation field folk music and high, what we considered high art, and this, so in terms of what what it actually sounded like, and the experience of what you're talking about, where no, don't write this down, or that's a hard thing to imagine what that originally might have been like. I mean, the closest we get to that is maybe the folks down in the Gullah Geechee country who still practice ring shout music, which I'm so fascinated by. And it's just very simple motivic music that's call and response. And there's, if you try, and folks are writing that down too. Choruses are performing that music too. They're writing ring shouts, and they're very simple, but they're very powerful because they're very rhythmic. And then you turn on the radio and you understand how that's influenced all of music everywhere. So
They're angry, they call it cultural.
and exactly. So
Well, I think we better come to a.
yeah, it's gonna be, it'll be